welcome back to JSMR, and I have a very special video for you guys today. First of all, this is going to be a bit of a long intro, so I apologize for that. I'll put a timestamp right here for anyone that just doesn't care for details and just wants to kind of get into the factoids. But really what I wanted to discuss before I get into the nitty-gritty of the video is why I am making this video. So of course, as you can clearly tell by the title and thumbnail, when I post this is a video regarding Pride Month. So Pride Month is very important to a lot of different people, I mean including myself and a lot of different people that are close to me in my life. So I did want to make this video for me and for them, you know, just highlighting a lot of cool things about the queer community over time, and I felt like it would just be a really important video to make for a lot of people, you know, starting out in June. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Also, making sure you all know that this is a safe spot to discuss topics like these, and you know, if you haven't been a viewer of me before, or you just haven't seen that many of my videos, you know, this is a safe space, and I'm willing to discuss a lot of these topics very openly. I'm a very open person. Feel free to comment down below with, you know, any positive comments, questions you have, and of course my socials are open for that as well. So I just wanted to get that all out of the way. We're gonna have some fun today, so let me introduce what I am actually going to be doing, because some of you may still be confused. So I have a book that I actually got when I was out in San Francisco, I think it was last summer. It's called Rainbow History Class by Hannah McElhenney. I believe they are popular on TikTok for a lot of these cool facts and stories about queer history and queer people throughout history. That's what I will be reading from today. Just a couple of other quick notes before we get in. Again, I had the timestamp right there if you guys just need to skip all of this, so sorry, but I just need you guys to know as well that when I use words like queer in this video, it's not anything derogatory. I know that used to be a derogatory word in the past, but we've repurposed it to be an umbrella for a wide array of different identities. So I did want to let you guys know that I completely understand that, and that's how I am using that word. Also, just a couple more small things. I do have my blue light glasses on because I did write a bit of a script for this video, and you will see just things reflecting all over my glasses. This is going to be recorded in two parts because a lot of the book I did find really interesting, and I wanted to cover a lot of it for this video. So if I look completely different in the middle of the video, that's why. I will go ahead and flip over to our first topic. Stop yapping your ears off, and let's get to the actual nitty-gritty of the video. Alright, so I think how I'm going to format this is I'm going to have the book right here in my hands down here, and I'm just going to put some information or visual stuff maybe over here. If you guys are wondering like what certain visuals and stuff are referencing. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and you know, if you want any more information on how anything looks or anything like that, I'll put some more information over here if I find it to be relevant. So let's go ahead and start with the tomb of Numatep and Nikanum, the rumored first example of a historical recording of two gay lovers. So Egyptologists have made numerous discoveries at Saqqara that give us clues about the way humans lived nearly 5,000 years ago. However, in 1964, they discovered a tomb that left them baffled. The tomb appeared to be in the burial place of two men who, according to the surrounding hieroglyphics, were royal manicurists named Numatep and Nikanum. For such an elite tomb to be shared by two men of the same rank, rather than a man surrounded by his wife and children, was highly unusual, especially given that both men had wives and children. Now, 1964 wasn't a wonderful year to be homosexual, so naturally, scholars concluded that two men may have been twins, even conjoined twins, or brothers at the very least. And of course, that's perfectly possible. There were no human remains in the tomb, so we have no way of proving or disproving a genetic connection. But brothers being buried together, let alone brothers who had wives, would have been unheard of at the time. There is, of course, another explanation, that the two men may have been lovers. It speaks volumes that the walls of Numatep and Nikanum's tomb consistently depict the men in positions exclusive to husband and wife, always embracing and often facing each other with their noses touching, which is the most intimate pose seen in ancient Egyptian art. The pair are pictured in front and center, with their purported wives appearing in the background in a manner that, according to some historians, suggests acceptance and even approval of the men's relationship. Historians and scholars have offered many explanations for these unusual finds, and it's impossible to entirely discredit these. But if the tomb of Numhotep and Nikanum contained man and woman, there would be no explanation required. Their marriage would be assumed. Remember, history is written through the lens and values of the present. But if we do take the clues presented to us by Numhotep and Nikanum, we may very well have documented evidence of the same-sex love dating back to the 25th century of BCE. That's impressive. A very long time ago. Ancient Egypt is one of the world's oldest civilizations. Artifacts from the time tell us a great deal about life back then, when pharaohs reigned and eyeliner was rightfully important. On top of the evidence we've seen from this tomb, there are other indications that same-sex love and eroticism was common at this time, and even accepted. Ancient texts refer to women sleeping with women, and numerous artworks depict women together with sexual symbolism. In Talmudic literature, which are ancient texts concerning Jewish law, sex between women was even described as the doings of the land of Egypt. That said, that doesn't mean these ancient Egyptians were homosexual, not in the modern sense, at least. The concept of who you're attracted to, forming part of your identity, won't emerge for a few thousand years yet. So, very cool stuff surrounding Numhotep and Nikanum there. I'll have a picture of the crypt right here, if that's not already up yet. So just a note for editor Jamie there. But yeah, so this seems to be the first instance recorded in history of two same-sex lovers, which is very impressive. Of course, the book here detailed that it was pretty uncommon at the time to be buried in the same tomb as somebody like your brother, and especially without family members, so that may indicate that their wives and children even approved of their supposed relationship. So very cool things to ponder there, and of course I might link a wiki page or something down below for a lot of these, but this is something I found very impressive. It's very, what word am I trying to find here? It's very intriguing to me, how the ancient Egyptians worked. And just how cryptic their history is because of all the hieroglyphics and just, lots of symbolism over, rather than literal descriptions of what history was like for them. So very, very cool thing to speculate about, and I think that's a very, very cool little tidbit from ancient Egyptian history. So let's go ahead and move on to our next section. So this is a pretty cool next section, or probably will be for a lot of you. We're going to focus on our first lone icon, named Hatshepsut, again, in the time of ancient Egyptian history. So just a little debrief before I go into this. Hatshepsut, sorry, I'm gonna butcher their name a lot, and I say there because this is the first vague recording in history of gender nonconformity, which is pretty cool because this wasn't even a thought of concept back then. So let's go ahead and dive in. So there was no concept of sexual identity in ancient times, but gender was definitely a thing. And one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, royally bent it better than anyone. Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh who reigned from around 1479 to 1458 BCE. Female pharaohs were rare, though not unheard of, but Hatshepsut was unlike any other female pharaoh. She ruled not as queen, but also as king. Hatshepsut was consistently portrayed in a masculine manner, usually with a male body, a beard, and in men's clothing. Pharaohs had godlike power in ancient Egypt, which meant Hatshepsut was in control of how she was viewed. She even designed her own tomb. She used that control to have many feminine depictions of herself changed to masculine ones. Male dress and false beards were traditional symbols of pharaonic office, so it's possible that Hatshepsut wore them to secure her status as a pharaoh, rather than a queen or wife of a king. Many ambitious women throughout history have done the same thing. However, writing from the period suggested that Hatshepsut had a more fluid relationship with gender. She used masculine terms like king alongside feminine pronouns, resulting in phrases that seem almost poetic now. His Majesty herself would make a wonderful social media bio, no? Hatshepsut had been claimed as a feminist who defied gender rules to stick it to the patriarchy, as well as the world's first transgender icon. Of course, none of these claims can be verified, and our insistence on defining the pharaoh's gender identity says a lot more about our obsession with binary gender than it does about Hatshepsut. There have been centuries of debate as to why Hatshepsut expressed her gender in such a way, but all that debate misses the point. There doesn't need to be a reason. Long live Her Majesty the King. So, very interesting topic there. Of course, I do think our obsession with gender identity in the modern era definitely plays a big part of how we view Hatshepsut. And so sorry I butchered that name so much in that passage. That was it's very hard to just kind of naturally read names I just learned. So, but yeah, very, very cool that this is the earliest example of gender nonconformity. And I'm not sure if Hatshepsut actually felt any gender nonconformity, or maybe there was just so much of a masculine image to live up to as a pharaonic icon. But I think, again, that's just something that's up to us to speculate. Again, history back in these times is so speculative to the modern eye because a lot of it is just so cryptic. But it's cool to think about. So let's go ahead and move on to our next topic, which is a little bit more depressing, but I guess not too much. I think it's just more defining something and understanding why it was used. So let's go ahead and get into that. Next up, we will be learning about the story of sodomy. Heads up, of course, I'm not sure how much it'll appear in the sections these will be reading, but the first sentence does disclaim that the word sodomy will appear a lot in this book. So, let's go ahead and get into what sodomy is and why and how it was used in the past and still is used, I guess, today. So, sodomy primarily refers to anal sex between men, but throughout history it has also been used to refer to acts considered against God, like bestiality or any sexual act that is not for procreation. The story behind the word dates back to a biblical scripture called the Book of Genesis, written around 600 BCE. It contains the tale of two ancient cities known as Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities had angered God with their wickedness and sin, so God supposedly sent two angels to destroy them. Abraham, in the midst of his new nation project, had a nephew who lived in Sodom, so asked God to spare the cities. God agreed, but only 50 righteous people could be found there. When the angels arrived, Abraham's nephew Lot welcomed them into the home to be shared with his wife and children. Unfortunately, the men of Sodom got word of the visitors and demanded to know them. In the biblical sense, this meant to have sex with them. So yeah, a lot going on in this city, looks like. Lot tried to bargain with them, offering his wife and virgin daughters up instead, but the angry men were determined to have their way with the angels. Obviously, there is nothing righteous about any of this, so a furious God rained fire and sulfur onto the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying them completely. According to the dominant interpretation, the sin of Sodom isn't the... Oh, sorry, lost my place. Isn't the Sodomites' actions, which were very clearly it is the fact that angels were male. If you're aghast at what is possibly the history's worst ever case of victim blaming, you're not alone. Many scholars share your thoughts, and some suggest it is more likely to have been the town's lack of hospitality that angered God. We don't actually know if these towns even existed, but we do know that this tale gave us the word sodomy and the enduring misconception that it's a sin. So, yeah. I don't want to get too far into my thoughts here because I may have some pretty controversial thoughts on religious texts according to some more extreme believers, but I generally do believe that the religious texts of the past have been widely misinterpreted as time has gone on. So, very interesting thing to think about there, and glad a lot of scholars do agree with me that a lot of that seems like just a whole bunch of victim blaming. Sorry, I cannot pronounce anything. I'm reading a lot of long passages, so get ready for a lot of vocal mishaps because I cannot read for long periods of time out loud and make it sound good. So let's go ahead and continue on with our topic of sodomy. Because I'll just go ahead and flip the pages here because it's a bit farther into the book where it picks up. I'll be flip-flopping a little bit throughout this one. So, this next section regarding sodomy regards the Catholic Church. So, let's go ahead and read on about them and how they used sodomy. Pretty shitty stuff upcoming here. So, eventually, the Catholic Church would split away from the Byzantine Church, which would become the Eastern Orthodox Church, over a disagreement about unleavened bread. But for now, the most important thing to stress is just how powerful the Church had become. The Catholic Church had tremendous influence over every echelon of society, from peasants to the king. But during the early Middle Ages, it wasn't too concerned with same-sex acts. After all, the portion of the scriptures that mentioned this was extremely minor in comparison to everything else they contained. Even if the church condemned same-sex liaisons on the basis of Sodom and Gomorrah, this was rarely enforced. There are even instances of bishops and other respected clergy members having male lovers and facing no punishment. Let's be frank, corruption has been a part of the church since its inception. Yeah, I think most of us knew that. Primarily, the Catholic Church was motivated by expanding its power, which is not always bad, but back then it got pretty rough. By the 12th century, however, the church deemed any sexual activity not for the purpose of procreation a sin. The sin of sodomy didn't just include same-sex relations, it also extended to masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, and sex with animals. Of course, it was difficult to prove that these acts had even occurred, so most people faced trial for sodomy were unlikely to have actually committed the sin in question, at least not when they were accused of having done so. Mostly, sodomy was a useful hook to hang your enemies on. So, that's a little bit more on how it was used in the past, unfortunately. Just something that was a little more accusatory than even rightfully enforced in some cases. So, yeah, let's read on a little bit about a more specific example about how that was used, very unfortunately. So, next up is the Order of Catholic Warrior Monks who were burnt for kissing each other's butts. So the Knights Templar was a military order of the Catholic Church that was founded during the Crusades. The order was made up of devout Catholic warrior monks who gave protection to pilgrims visiting the Holy Land of Jerusalem. The Templar also established an early form of banking across the Christian Empire. They were extremely wealthy and lent a lot of money to King Philip IV of France. The king's debt to the Templar grew, and he needed a way out. Luckily for him, there had been rumors of secret initiation rites among the Templar that involved kissing senior members in obscene places, including but not limited to the mouth, buttocks, anus, and lower back, as well as practicing witchcraft. The king, an opportunistic fellow, used the rumors to his advantage, announcing an inquisition to this rumored butt-kissing. Under interrogation by order of the king, the Knights Templar confessed to Sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, the Knights Templar confessed to obscene sexual practices, including the aforementioned kissing, as well as heresy and worshipping a horned deity with 3 faces. These confessions, however, can't be taken at face value because interrogation at the time meant torture. The Knights would have admitted to almost anything. Most of the Templars eventually retracted their confessions, but this wasn't much help. Many were burned at the stake for their transgressions, and the king forced the pope to disband the order. The tale of the Templar has long been a source of intrigue. The horned deity and monks allegedly worshipped has become a prominent occult symbol associated with modern mysticism, while an oft-told legend that the Templar were the keepers of the Holy Grail was given a new life in the 2000s thanks to Dan Brown's best-selling novel The Da Vinci Code, which, if you weren't on my first stream about a week ago, I mentioned that that is one of my favorite books of all time. Definitely would recommend that one to anyone who hasn't read it. It has a very awesome twist, and Dan Brown's just a good writer in general. Going on with the passage though, sorry, I love Da Vinci Code so much. It's impossible to know if there's any truth to any of these rumors, but you know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire. It is highly likely that homosexuality was practiced among the Templar, as well as in other monastic orders. Monks were sworn to celibacy with women and traveled vast distances with only themselves for company. It's likely there were certain initiation rites with a sexual element to them. After all, sex has been used to these ends throughout history all over the world. Written artifacts of the time show that these monastic orders didn't view same-sex practices with any particular disdain, which speaks volumes, as monks lived very rule-oriented lives. And hey, if you were a man who happened to be same-sex attracted, what could be better than being forced to swear off female flesh and ride out your days in the company of men? So yeah, a very interesting excerpt there on when and how sodomy was used for very, very bad reasons. So that was very interesting to read about, and something that I felt would add a little bit more value to delving through the history throughout this book. So let's go ahead and move on to our next section. Alright, so our next section is regarding an icon, a poet named Sappho. So, the word lesbian really just means person from Lesbos, an island just off the coast of Turkey. And on the island of Lesbos, right at the edge of ancient Greece, lived a poet named Sappho. Most historians place Sappho's birth somewhere between 640 and 610 BCE. Sappho was a very prolific poet, admired by many in her time, but only fragments of her work remain. Sappho wrote playfully and exquisitely about love and desire between women, hence the use of the words lesbian and sapphic to describe women who experience queer attraction. Despite being written thousands of years ago, the dramatic feelings Sappho describes in her poetry echo our experiences of love today. These next lines could easily be found in the messaging app of any modern lesbian. And here is the poem that I will quote now. I have had not one word from her. Frankly, I wish I were dead. When she left, she wept a great deal. She said to me, this parting must be endured, Sappho. I go unwillingly. We still can't really say that Sappho herself was a lesbian in the modern sense. All we know about her life is what her poetry indicates, and poetry isn't necessarily non-fiction. It's probably worth stating that the fairly obvious but still mind-bending fact that the ancient Greeks lived a really long time ago. So long ago that there were historians of ancient Greece who lived in ancient Greece. The popular idea of ancient Greece, say that 5 times fast, my god, with its sun-bleached stone pillars and wandering philosophers, is actually just one particular time period, known as the Classical Age. Sappho lived close to a century before this, in a period called the Archaic Era. Greeks during the Classical Age were enamored with Sappho, They wrote plays about her and documented her, but they were as close to sitting down and getting to know her as today's historians are to hanging out with Thomas Edison. They projected her classical-era biases onto her, devaluing her work because she was female, sexualizing her, and perhaps even deliberately distorting her. This all helps explain why so much literature surrounding Sappho is relegated to interpretation. In the many centuries since Sappho wrote of a woman wearing garlands of violets, every discovery made about her has thrown up more questions. Historians agree that her poetry would have been sung and accompanied by a lyre. Beyond that, however, there are controversies surrounding almost every aspect of her life, including whether her work was ever performed in public and whether she had a daughter. But there is nothing more hotly debated than Sappho's sexuality. It's been suggested that she was a teacher or leader trusted with educating a collective of young women, and that Sappho's desire for these students was expressed in her poetry. The truth is, we will never know the truth. Arguing about the sexuality of a person who existed so long ago is pretty redundant, but for better or for worse, Sappho has become a symbol, and it's easy to believe poetry that so viscerally describes desire between women could only have been written by a woman who'd felt it herself. So, very interesting icon there, Sappho. I found that very intriguing. I love ancient poetry, and I think it's really just a step up from the ancient Egyptians' hieroglyphics, and just how cryptic it is, because although it is words that are written out, poetry itself, and it can lead us on to more specific conclusions about what a historical figure is trying to convey. It still is sometimes even just as cryptic as hieroglyphics. There really is just so much you can interpret from a poem. So I found that bit of information very, very cool, and we'll leave it up to you guys. Who you think Sappho really was in the past. Next up, we're going to be learning about the story of ancient Greece's queer answer to Adam and Eve. This should be very interesting because Adam and Eve is a highly contested topic among many people, not just historians and philosophers and devoutly religious people. So, another highlight of the symposium is comic playwright Aristophanes telling a queer creation story that explains why people feel whole when they find love. According to Aristophanes, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, call me out. Humans were once doubles, being with 4 feet, 4 hands, and 2 sets of genitals. And there were not 2 sexes, but 3. One sex comprising of a man, one of a woman and a woman, and a third of man and woman, known as androgynous. The men were born from sun, women from the earth, and androgynous from the moon. When the humans angered Zeus, he severed them in 2, leaving them to go through life seeking their other halves. Men and women from the androgynous would find each other and be able to mate. Women from the original woman would not desire men, and instead become each other's partners, while men from the original man would continue life together in sexual satisfaction. It may sound absurd, but no more so than the story of Adam and Eve and their forbidden fruit. Aristophanes does not say that the ideal form of love is a relationship between men, because this is the most manly, which makes sense if you equate manliness with goodness, like the Greeks did. But what is remarkable in this story is that these attractions are presented as 3 equally viable combinations, and that tells us a lot about attitudes to same-sex relationships at this time, which is very interesting because in the modern world, same-sex love is still seen as a minority population of people. So continuing on, the symposium would make an excellent basis for a reality TV show. There was plenty of drama among the drinking and philosophy. Some of the speeches had a secondary agenda of getting another guest into bed, and at one point someone drunkenly crashes the party to lament that Socrates won't sleep with him. There's even one committed same-sex couple there, Agathon and Pausanias. In his speech, Pausanias argued in favor of same-sex eros, in particular the virtue of the love between an older man and a boy around the age when he begins to grow a beard. Relationships between men and boys are a well-documented phenomenon of ancient Greece. See Sparta for more info on that. The practice known as pederasty involved the pairing of an Aristes, an older, more experienced man, with an Eromenos, a more youthful boy. It was considered a mutually beneficial trade. The younger received tutelage and guidance, while the older received sexual satisfaction. It seems that in some societies, such as Athens, pederastic relationships were primarily confined to the elite social classes, while in Spartan society they were more of a rite of passage, a mandatory part of the progression into adulthood. The age gap appeared to vary according to the unique culture and customs of the different city-states. The Erenamos would be an adolescent boy anywhere between the ages of 12 and 18, while the Orestes was a man who had reached adulthood but was not old. Typically, they would be in their 20s. There would be many rules. The Aristes could be punished if he were deemed to be too keenly pursuing a younger boy, while the Erenamos had to be careful not to seduce an older man, or he could face penalties for prostitution. It was important that the Erenamos was not seen to be forced into the relationship, even though it couldn't exactly be considered free will. The roles within relationships were also strictly laid out. The word Aristes roughly translates to lover. Oh, sorry, I tapped the mic there. Let me reread that. The roles within the relationships were also strictly laid out. The word Aristes roughly translates to lover, while the word Erenamos means beloved. The distinction between who was doing the loving and who was being loved was fundamentally important. The older man must be the active participant, while the younger must take the passive role. However, if the younger man continued to take the passive role once he came of age, he would be mocked. There are many, usually quite explicit, artworks of the period depicting these relationships. These can be very confronting, especially when we view them through the lens of our modern ethics, which would categorically say that such a power dynamic would mean consent is impossible. However, even if these relationships would be unethical, and in most places illegal, today it is vital to understand that pederasty is not pedophilia. This is a challenging part of queer history to navigate, as the conflation of homosexuality with pedophilia continues to harm our community, even today. Very true. There are many things within the queer community and just queer space in general that are wrongly conflated with pedophilia. And rare instances where, there are not safe spaces for children, but it does need to be emphasized that that is much more of a minority than some people blow it out of a proportion to be. So overall, that topic is pretty interesting. I'm a big fan of ancient Greece, and I just listened to an episode on one of my favorite podcasts called Time Suck by Dan Cummins. Definitely recommend that to anybody into true crime, ancient history, cults, with a lot of comedy mixed in. But there was a lot of detail about those same-sex relationships in that episode of the podcast. So very interesting to see something I recently learned about in the book. And just very cool to see, ancient Greece's take on homosexuality and how that was widely interpreted within their religious beliefs. So let's go ahead and move on to the next section, which is pretty similar, which is same-sex love within a Chinese dynasty. So, this exact story is called The Passion of the Cut Sleeve. The ancient Greeks have a reputation for same-sex liaisons, but all the way over in ancient China, they were just as popular. You've probably experienced the agony of observing your partner, or pet for that matter, sleeping sweetly beside you, their precious head on your arm. That closeness is lovely until you realize you need to pee. Definitely has happened to me way too many times. The same thing has happened to Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty China, 206 BCE to 220 CE. It's said that Emperor Ai and his lover, Dong Xian, were enjoying a nap together at the palace in Chang'an, which is now Xi'an in China. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pronouncing Chinese to the best of my ability. When the emperor awoke, he found Dong Xian, lying asleep on the sleeve of his robe. Rather than risk waking his beloved, he simply cut off his sleeve. Word of this tender act spread throughout the palace, and soon Emperor Ai's courtiers began cutting off their own sleeves as a tribute to the emperor's show of affection. The single-sleeve robe became something of a trend, and a euphemism for same-sex love was born. Even today, in China, same-sex love is referred to as the passion of the cut sleeve. Emperor Ai certainly wasn't the only Han Dynasty emperor to have a male lover. All 10 emperors were said to have relationships with other men alongside their wives. The idea of having male and female partners was normalized in China during this period. Sima Xuan, a Chinese historian of the early Han Dynasty, who himself lived before Emperor Ai, but documented the phenomenon of these male favorites, wrote, "It is not women alone who can use their looks to attract the eyes of the ruler. Courtiers and eunuchs can play that game as well. Many were the men of ancient times who gained favor this way." The emperor's male lovers received exceedingly special treatment, which was entirely accepted, so long as the emperor produced an heir with his empress. But Emperor Ai did not produce an heir. No surviving records show that Emperor Ai was ever interested in women, and the favoritism shown towards Dong Xian soon became an issue in the palace. Not only was the emperor rewarding Dong Xian with grain, he also bestowed great gifts and important titles upon his family. As Emperor Ai's health declined with illness, Dong Xian's power at the palace rose dramatically until the emperor, on his deathbed, expressed his desire to leave the entire kingdom to Dong Xian. This, unfortunately, was too much for the court, who stepped in and forced Dong Xian and his wife to kill themselves. Pretty extreme way of telling them to give up the kingdom. There are other tales of same-sex desire from ancient China, and they all have this almost parabolic quality to them. Historian Brett Hinch, in his book Passions of the Cut Sleeve, notes that the way narrative and meaning have been written around these events shows a consciousness around same-sex love that has helped subsequent generations of queer people see themselves in history. This story shows us that over 2,000 years ago, people in China were moved by same-sex love, just as they are today, and that the desire to let sleeping lovers lie is a part of us, wherever and whenever we are. What a wonderful section, and something I'd honestly like to put a little bit more research into and know a little bit more about, because ancient China and the many Chinese dynasties are just such an interesting period and have such a long and rich history. So, we are going to move on to the next section, which is more poetry. Very excited about that. Alright, so our next section here is going to be another icon by the name of Rumi. So Rumi was another poet. So let's read a little bit more about what time period he's from and what he did. So, Jalal al-Din Rumi was born in Persia in 1207 and was raised according to Sufism, a brand of Islamic mysticism concerned with awakening a Muslim spirituality through direct experiences with God. Rumi found this direct connection through poetry, which he was believed to recite while whirling around and around in a state of religious rhapsody. This practice gave rise to a group of followers known as the, sorry, I lost my place. This practice gave rise to a group of followers known as the whirling dervishes, who continued this style of moving meditation in Rumi's name after his death. Rumi never wrote a word down. However, he had a circle of dedicated scribes who compiled collections of his work. Rumi's poetry burns with divine love and has captivated much of the world's imagination for centuries. A major revival in the mid-2000s led to Rumi being crowned the highest-selling poet in the United States. Pretty cool. Rumi's wisdom on love famously helped Coldplay's Chris Martin navigate his divorce from Gwyneth Paltrow, and his phrasings have been stylized on JPEGs of long exposure night skies and shared all over the internet tagged inspo and food for thought. You'll find Rumi's work on Ivanka Trump's Twitter and even tattooed just near Brad Pitt's right armpit. Sadly, Rumi's most well-known words have been lost in translation. We'd recommend doing your due diligence before immortalizing them on your skin or wedding invitations. Another thing that has been lost in the mythologization of Rumi is that he was first and foremost a Muslim. Rumi, like his father, was a Sufi scholar. He rose to become an eminent teacher in Islamic law and circulated among the highest echelons of Islamic society. Alongside his mysticism and poetry, he practiced Islam throughout his life, praying and fasting and offering his interpretations of Islamic law. But when Rumi met Shams Tabrizi in 1244 CE, everything changed. Shams became Rumi's beloved teacher, soulmate and new subject of Rumi's poetry. The two were inseparable. Rumi wrote of Shams like one might write of a god. In fact, the distinction between the two isn't exactly clear. His writing became increasingly homoerotic, including phrases like, and I quote, "I am your harp. You strike me like a plectrum. On every part of my body. How can't I cry?" Sounds very reminiscent of Sappho's poetry. Rumi and Shams locked themselves away for 40 nights to speak and exchange ideas about divine love, and it's been suggested that here their love took on a physical element. Rumi and Shams were together for a short time, only 2 years, before Shams mysteriously disappeared. He may have been killed out of jealousy by someone close to Rumi, or he may have simply left. All we know is that Rumi was left consumed by grief, whether their relationship was physical or platonic. Its queerness is in pain of separation. In finding love and losing it, countless queer people have felt that white-hot pain. Very interesting. I really dig a poet, and just very beautiful to see somebody, repress the norms of their current society while still holding such a, large amount of faith in their religious beliefs. So that's what I found really cool about that section. And of course, I always love some cryptic poetry. So let's go ahead and move on to probably one of my favorite sections that we'll be covering tonight, and that is the Renaissance featuring Billy Shakespeare. All right, so starting off with just, the general Renaissance. Though concentrated in Italy, the Renaissance was a period of cultural reckoning across Europe, when the dominant ideologies of the previous centuries were all up for debate. Not even the might of the Catholic Church could escape the scrutiny of the new intelligentsia. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church had grown extremely wealthy off the people, and it showed in the gilded castles and decadent churches occupying prime real estate in every city. The cracks of corruptions were beginning to show, and they caught the eye of a German man named Martin Luther. Luther believed that instead of getting the word of God from the Pope, who he suspected was more focused on decadence and power than worship, people should actually pick up the Bible. Luther's Luther's back to basics approach to Christianity won him a dedicated following, and as a result, the Catholic Church splintered and new branches of Christianity emerged. One was named after Luther himself, Lutheranism, and this, along with the other new branches, fell under what we know as Protestantism. This new brand of Christianity centered around the scriptures and involved each person in making a personal covenant with God. The rise of Protestantism had the secondary effect of increasing literacy, because Protestants were actually required to read the Bible, whereas under the Catholic Church, you had the clergy to tell you what to do. This development, combined with the emergence and printing press in Europe, meant many more people had access to the Bible, and, as a result, were introduced to our old friends in the Book of Leviticus and Sodom and Gomorrah. Sorry. Historians tend to describe this period as the Reformation, as it marked a series of reforms to Christianity. The First Reformation, which swept across continental Europe, was soon followed by an English Reformation. This too was characterized by a shift towards Protestantism, but for a slightly different reason. The King of England, Henry VIII, wanted a divorce. The Roman Catholic Church refused to allow this. So, in a fairly audacious power move, the king decided to make his own religion, which he was the head of, the Church of England. As you might have guessed, this new brand of Christianity was fine with divorce. King Henry VIII decreed his new church and the only official Church of England. However, winding back centuries of Catholic influence was always going to be a big ask. He needed a way to wrench power from the Catholic Church. During this period, some offenses still came under jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which reported into Rome. Sodomy, which in England was called buggery, sorry, had to turn on the accent for that one, was one such offense. In a breathtakingly petty move that would go on to cause centuries of pain, King Henry VIII made buggery a civil offense, signing into law the Buggery Act of 1533. Now, for the first time, there was a civil law prohibiting sodomy. This would form the precedent for anti-homosexuality laws around the world. In other words, King Henry VIII has a lot to answer for, but the fun doesn't end there. Some people in England believed that the Church of England was stopping short of its Protestant potential, so a group of fundamentalist Protestants emerged. This group, known as the Puritans, made life very difficult for those who were same-sex attracted. Puritans live austere lives of restraint, eschewing all earthly pleasures in favor of worshipping and studying the Bible. They loved all things frivolous, but none more than the theatre. And the cross-dressing, yeah, that too. They really hated that. So, yeah, very interesting general section about the Renaissance period there. Big power move from Henry VIII. Hated his wife so much and wanted to divorce so badly that he made a whole new church. Obviously just for the sake of divorcing his wife. So, must have been a very rowdy queen back then. I don't know if I would go through the effort of starting a religion to reinforce my belief in divorce, but that's what Henry VIII did, and I would respect that power move a lot more if he didn't start with the anti-sodomy and anti-homosexual legislature. So, yeah, probably a big proponent in modern influence of that type of legislature, even in a lot of countries today. So, pretty crazy figure, Henry VIII. So yeah, let's go ahead and move on to somebody that I'm a lot more excited to talk about, which is Billy Shakes. William Shakespeare is another icon highlighted in this book that is very popular with me and all of my fellow theater kids. So let's just jump right into it because this is just such an interesting section. So, William Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer of the English language, and his stories tap into the human condition so well they feel eternally relevant. As well as his mastery of words, Shakespeare's ideas of gender were way ahead of their time. During this period, the theta was a popular part of English life and a solid source of entertainment. Women, however, weren't allowed to perform on the stage. They were required to remain pious at all times and absolutely could not take part in such an ungodly spectacle. Women performing for an audience in exchange for money was associated with sex work, which was also considered extremely ungodly. Shakespeare ostensibly navigated this by having boys play women's roles. It may have been better than women participating in these intolerable mischiefs to churches, as Puritan William Prine described it. But the Puritans were horrified by the idea of cross-dressing, even if it continued off stage. Or especially if it continued off stage, sorry. Although the Puritans held a lot of power, it appears that Shakespeare actually baited them in his plays. In As You Like It, Shakespeare weaves the act of cross-dressing into the story, writing a female character who dresses in men's clothing. As You Like It is very good, by the way. I would definitely give that a watch or a read-through if you have a chance. Surely this boy dressing as a woman, dressing as a man situation could only be some kind of Puritan dog whistle. In Twelfth Night, also a very good one, I just watched that one with my partner. Shakespeare goes even further, including another deliberately cross-dressing character, but also a Puritan character, Malvolio, who is portrayed as hypocritical, selfish, and power-hungry. It would have been highly risky for Shakespeare to invert gender roles in the way that he did, so we can only assume these choices were deliberate, perhaps an act of defiance and protest, or some kind of camp inside joke. Shakespeare's own gender and sexuality are the subject of constant debate. He was married to someone named Anne Hathaway, which has birthed a conspiracy theory, that the modern actress Anne Hathaway's husband, Adam Schulman, is actually a reincarnation of Shakespeare. There's a striking resemblance between the two, and had children. However, at this time, marriage, love, and sex remained separate spheres. Many of his sonnets appear to be directed towards a young man and contain homoerotic wordplay. Of course, poetry isn't always autobiographical, but a good many Shakespeare scholars believe his sexuality aligned with what today we might call bisexual or queer. And let's face it, any enemy of the Puritans was probably a friend of ours. So, awesome section. And very, very glad that, my good old Billy Shakes was covered in this book. I do want to book that mark. Sorry, I have mush mouth today. I do want to bookmark that real quick and go off on a little side note for 1 sec. So, I think this is the second time I've mentioned this video, but I've been listening to a lot of Time Suck by Dan Cummins lately, and one of those episodes that I've been listening to is the Shakespeare episode. And that's where Billy Shakes comes from, if you were wondering why I kept calling Shakespeare Billy. But that's besides the point. It's actually really, really cool, and adds a lot more to the theory that Shakespeare may have been some form of queer, whether it was gay, bisexual. He did have children, but he wasn't exactly always fond of his wife, or so it's told. In his will, he actually left his wife the second best bed of his house, and gave the best bed in his house to his children, which establishes a little bit of contempt for his wife. I'm not sure if maybe his wife and him just had a disagreement at some point. He also, their relationship was described with a little bit of tension as well, as far as that went, but they did stay married throughout their life, and he died a married man. Although the most interesting part about the speculation behind his homoerotic homoerotic sonnets, sorry, was that he didn't want most of his sonnets even being released to the public at all. He wanted to keep his sonnets a secretive part of him. And I theorize that that is either because, of course, as we might speculate, a lot of the homoeroticism that he displayed in his sonnets, he wanted to keep just underwater. He didn't want people maybe knowing that he was any type of like queer, or he just didn't want to come under scrutiny for just generally under any kind of scrutiny for the homoeroticism that he included in those sonnets. So just a very interesting side note that I did want to add if any of you are really kind of unfamiliar with Shakespeare, but he did have a few pretty cool signs that left a lot of people speculating throughout history if he ever was at least interested in any kind of homosexual relationship. So, very, very cool stuff there. Next up, we will be moving on to, I think it's called The Gay Life of Pirates. So let me go ahead and turn there. Alright, I was correct. It is called The Very Gay Life of Pirates. So, as you've probably gathered by now, life for most people during the age of exploration wasn't very pleasant. But one of the better places to find yourself was on board a pirate ship. The end of the age of exploration overlapped with the golden age of piracy, which began in the mid-1600s and lasted until the 1730s. When pirates attacked, they would not steal the loot and commandeer the ship, killing anyone who got in their way. They would do all of that, not would not. Yeah, they stole, looted, and commandeered the ship and very much killed people. I don't know why I added not there. It was a simple, successful formula. They were picky about the vessels they chose to attack, and they weren't picky about their crew either. In fact, pirate ships were radically inclusive compared to life on land. Often, but not always, when pirates attacked slave ships, those on board were able to join the pirate crew. Formerly enslaved crew members were treated relatively equally to the rest of the crew. It wasn't freedom, but on balance, historians believe it was far better than the life that awaited them in the Americas. It's important to note, however, that the relationship between piracy and slavery is complex. Some pirate crews profited directly from the slave trade, while others greatly hampered it. Pirate life wasn't just appealing to those seeking freedom from enslavement. The lawlessness of life at sea also attracted the rebellious and adventurous, and the same sex attracted. As you know, homosexuality was illegal and punished harshly in many places in this time, but pirates were an all-male crew. So to reduce tension on board, men would begin relationships with one another. These relationships weren't a secret, and they weren't just tolerated, they were encouraged, and even formalized in a kind of civil union called a matelage. Maletage, sorry, that's how you pronounce that. Matelots would do everything together. They would fight side by side and embrace before entering battle. They were also granted inheritance rights. If one matelot died in battle, their possessions and loot would automatically go to the other. Society has taken years to grant these same rights to our community, and we're still a long way off in many countries and are fighting to defend them in others. Very true. I'm sure a lot of you know this. Matelotage, like marriage, could occur in a range of reasons, not all of them romantic, but we do have records of pirate love stories, like the one between Captain Bartholomew Roberts and George Wilson. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, known on the pirate scene as Black Bart, was the most swashbucklingly stylish pirate on the high seas. He was known for wearing a crimson waistcoat and an expensive hat featuring an instantly recognizable red feather, the sight of which caused his targets to surrender almost immediately. As far as pirate captains go, Robert was very strict. He kept his crew on a tight leash, reportedly taking a hardline stance against gambling and demanding that lights were out by 8 p.m. But Roberts developed a soft spot for the ship's young surgeon, George Wilson. Witnesses at the time attest to the pair's intimacy on board, and they were engaged in a matelotage. Sorry, I'm going to keep mispronouncing that. Pledging to blow up and go to hell together if they were ever captured. Another pirate was even alleged that Roberts dressed up in a fresh set of clothes for Wilson, which is nice because despite being surrounded by water, Pirates aren't really known for their cleanliness. All things considered, the pirate life wasn't perfect, but if you were a queer buccaneer, it was gold. Sounds pretty cool, and especially with the slave trade going on at that time, very heinous actions from the human race back then. Still many things that happen now in the current day and age, but much worse back then when there was just a lot less regard for human rights and a lot less regulation on who actually had those. But very cool story about how pirates were back then, and Captain Bartholomew. Wow, sounds like he was dripped out. I respect that, and I don't know. Bartholomew is like one of my favorite names ever. I love that name for no reason at all. It's just such a silly name, but very cool that that was just such a common thing, especially in a lawless place like that. When you turn to lawlessness and anarchy, the projected outcome is not always very good. When you live in an environment with no rules, that may be a very toxic environment to be in, especially when nobody has a firm control over one another. But it seems like the pirates had it down pat. They had a good system going, and a lot of stuff was obviously very much accepted. So very cool. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section. So the next section I've read multiple times. I found it very cute. But it's another icon, and this one is on the public universal friend. So let's read a little bit more about it. I think you guys will like this one. In 1752, a child was born in the colony of Rhode Island. The child, a descendant of the original Quakers, was assigned female at birth and given the name Jemima Wilkinson. The Wilkinsons instilled in their child Quaker beliefs such as prison reform, anti-slavery, teetotalism, and plain dress. In 1776, Wilkinson fell gravely ill with a fever that spread through the colony, believed to have been typhus. Wilkinson's fever ravaged their body for days, and when it broke, they announced that Jemima Wilkinson had died, and they were in fact a preacher who was neither male nor female, and who had been sent by God to inhabit Jemima's body. This genderless preacher would only be known as the Public Universal Friend, or the Friend for short. The Public Universal Friend adopted an androgynous gender expression, mixing male and female attire, such as skirts and neckties. The Friend wore their hair cropped close to their scalp on top, with long ringlets down and back on the sides. The Public Universal Friend was met with distrust among the community. The Friend's family didn't believe them and took issue with the Friend making themselves unique. Others in the community saw Friend as either a spectacle or something to be feared. Yet the Friend was unwavering in their mission. They traveled throughout Northern America preaching God's word, calling for the abolition of slavery and arguing against marriage. They soon attracted a large group of followers, who came to be known as the Society of Universal Friends. Many of these Universal Friends were persuaded by the Friend to see their enslaved people, and a big portion remained unmarried. To free their enslaved people, sorry, not see them. And of course remain unmarried. A particularly large subsection of the Society of Universal Friends were unmarried women, following the Friends' teachings that women ought to obey God, not men. As the Society of Universal Friends grew, the Friend began to attract criticism from newspapers, and soon noisy crowds would assemble wherever they preached. At the turn of the next century, the Friend's health began to decline, and in 1819 the Friend delivered a final sermon before the second death of that body. The event was marked in the Society's death book in a single entry that reads, 25 minutes past 2 on the clock, the Friend went from here. After the Friend's death, the Society of Universal Friends continued their service, but over time the Society also faded into obscurity. The legacy of the Public Universal Friend, however, has not. Throughout history, gender-diverse people have found a kindred spirit in the Friend, who understand that to exist above gendered lines can be sacred. What a wonderful story. And even outside of the gender nonconformity displayed so bravely by somebody at this time, and I say bravely because it was such a threat to just be anything but the norm in colonial America, and I should say post-colonial Britain. So, very cool story, and very good values. I mean, I know marriage is a very sacred thing, and I think it should stay that way. But of course, nobody should ever be forced into marriage if they don't want that. And that was a very big custom at the time. Is you were expected to get married, and you still are in most places today. And that's a very big freedom to grant to somebody, is giving them the choice to marry or not marry and live their love life how they want to. And I think that's a very popular theme among a lot of the queer community today. As well as just generally, what else was I going to mention? I'm so sorry. As well as yeah, slavery abolition. I don't know how I forgot that one, but yeah, that's a very good thing. Again, slavery, not good, especially at this time when human rights just weren't as much of a thing for a majority of people. I don't even want to say a minority. I feel like it was more of a minority that was in the upper echelon of the ruling classes and just the upper classes in general at the time. Even people who weren't forcefully enslaved, poor sharecroppers and farmers and people just not really able to get by, who were maybe more economically discriminated against as well. Just a lot of crazy divides at this time. And just, I'll totally support anyone who's standing up for the underdog. I love my underdogs, That's why I'm a Detroit Lions fan. Even though year after year I keep getting disappointed. Even though God left our team in the playoffs this year, I was still watching that game and I was still rooting for the underdogs. So, just a theme I really like to keep on going, and I know it's a favorite theme among many people that are like myself. So I did want to include that in this video. So let's go on to our next section, which is a familiar name to many of you. Surprise, we're doing another icon, and this time it'll be Oscar Wilde. So we actually have a few pages about Oscar, Mr. Wilde, so we will be reading through all of those right now. So let's just dive into it, because there's so many details. Oscar Wilde, or Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty, Wills Wilde, if he was in trouble. I never knew that was his full name. I hope I pronounced one of those middle names right, at least. Was born in Dublin in 1854. Dublin's so beautiful. I want to visit there so bad. He was a prolific writer whose literary career covered off every medium you could imagine. He wrote academic papers and criticism. He became a journalist. He edited a women's magazine. He authored lectures on interior design. He wrote fairy tales, plays, political essays, and prose. Wow, big resume. What couldn't the man do? Wilde settled in London, married a woman named Constance Lloyd, who had 2 children named Cyril and Vivian. And in 1891 wrote his first and only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, an ode to youth and beauty. Upon publication, it was dismissed as immoral, not just for the hedonism of the characters and their aesthetic sensibilities, but also for its homoerotic themes. The novel tells the story of a man who is intoxicated by the beauty of a younger man, which has proved to be rather prophetic. Not long after the book's release, Wilde found himself utterly transfixed by the poet Lord Alfred Douglas, who Wilde would fondly know as Bosie. Bosie was rich, spoilt, beautiful, and 16 years Wilde's junior. He wrote extensively about same-sex love, evocatively describing it as the love that dare not speak its name. Bosie and Wilde met their match in another and began a tumultuous affair that would go on to be the great Oscar Wilde's undoing. Bosie drew Wilde into London's underworld of parties and rent boys, young male sex workers. Many were teenagers of the working class, and Wilde would buy their company in the kind of exploitative relationship we've seen similarly powerful men continue to engage in over recent years. Very funny side note, yeah, that's still very valid with a lot of politicians that are in my area. So, if that gives you any hint as to where I live, I don't know what will. Anyway, Oscar Wilde's downfall unfolded in tragic irony, like the storyline of one of his own plays. Bosie was the son of John Douglas, Marquess of Queensberry, a British and brutish nobleman and avid boxer who was disgusted when he heard rumors of his son's affair. When Wilde refused to end the affair, the Marquis embarked on a widespread harassment campaign that culminated on Valentine's Day in 1895 at the grand opening of Wilde's best-known work, The Importance of Being Earnest. Sorry, that one snuck up on me. At the St. James's Theatre in London. Knowing the upper echelons of society would be in attendance, the Marquess purchased a ticket and planned to throw a bouquet of rotting vegetables on the stage to humiliate the playwright. However, Queensberry was barred from entry. This sent him into such a rage that he instead scrawled a message on the calling card that read for Oscar Wilde posing sodomite. Okay, actually he wrote somdomite, but you get the idea, and so did everyone else. Can't even spell sodomite right. Wow. This was a dangerous accusation and a real threat to Wilde's shining reputation. So, in retaliation, Wilde sued his lover's father for libel. Here's the thing about libel. It doesn't apply if the accusation is true, so Queensberry's defense hired private detectives to investigate Wilde's same-sex liaisons. The detectives persuaded a handful of rent boys to spill about their relationships with Wilde, which was enough to clear Queensberry of all charges and put Oscar Wilde on trial for gross indecency. Big mistake. In a spectacular backfire, Wilde found himself sentenced to prison with 2 years hard labor. After his release, Wilde moved to France, penniless and disgraced, and briefly reunited with Bosie, who had abandoned him throughout both his trial and his time in prison. But the reunion wasn't exactly a redemptive love story. Bosie once again abandoned Wilde after his family threatened to cut him off if the relationship continued. At rock bottom, Wilde confined himself in his hotel room, where he died on the 30th of November in 1900, 3 years after his release from prison. Lord Alfred Douglas is often spoken about as the man who ruined Oscar Wilde. This is true, but we would also add Henry Labouchere, the Marquess of Queensberry, and Wilde's own ego. In 2017, Oscar Wilde was posthumously pardoned of his gross indecency charge, along with tens of thousands of other men. In the eyes of the law, Wilde is now entirely innocent, but as Wilde's conduct with young boys comes into focus, this innocence has been called into question. Often, society's thirst for nostalgia, good news, and inspiration leads us to cling on to historical figures like Oscar Wilde as symbols, and in the process forget that they're people, and people are fallible. Alright, there's a little bit more about Oscar Wilde, but I do have a lot of comments about this story so far. As well as being known for his literary works, and for the unfortunate scandal that proved his undoing, Wilde contributed greatly to aestheticism, an artistic movement that is best defined as by the phrase "art for art's sake," which would basically mean that art should be cherished for its aesthetic value over any socio-political end. Aesthetes were against the idea that art required a moral or message, instead believing that it should set a mood, please the senses, or simply exist just to be beautiful. For aesthetes like Wilde, art wasn't confined to the gallery walls or poetry collections. Instead, all of his life could and should count as art, and therefore have aesthetic value. The way a person dressed and behaved, and what they chose to read and eat, the relationships they embarked upon, all these things should be beautiful. This life as art approach led to a particular subculture or type of person known as a dandy, of which Oscar Wilde is a notorious example. Flamboyant dress and makeup, charming wit, and dedication to their own leisure are all hallmarks of a 19th century dandy. The requirement wasn't necessarily to be rich, but to behave as if one was, a sentiment that continues to reemerge with trend cycles. Looking at you, Anna Delvey. If you're thinking that these dandies seem a little self-obsessed, you wouldn't be alone, especially if you were around in the Victorian era, a period often defined by its moralism. During this time in the United States in the early 1880s, Oscar Wilde was constantly parodied in the press and caricatured in cartoons for his vanity and egotism. In one cartoon, he is depicted as Narcissus, the Greek mythological figure who was so beautiful he fell in love with his own reflection. This depiction was intended to humiliate Wilde, but to be honest, he probably found it flattering. Oscar Wilde's celebrity status led to society to connect many of the things associated with Wilde: his style, modern painting and writing, the way he wore his hair, and his quick wit, with homosexuality. Now everyone was warmed with a kind of checklist of things to look out for, forcing homosexual people into secrecy. The sentencing of Oscar Wilde marked the end of a certain naivety towards queer people. It sent a strong message that deviancy was a serious crime and set a precedent for its punishment. When news of Wilde's downfall made its way to Germany, a science-minded man named Magnus Hirschfeld found himself preoccupied with the trial. He believed that the kind of deviancy Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for was innate in certain people, and so found himself wrestling with the question of how an element of one's nature could be considered a criminal act. And look, that's a pretty good question. Yeah, so that was a pretty big read there, but Oscar Wilde, pretty amazing. Sounds like a pretty big narcissist, and had a pretty interesting age gap with some boys he slept with. But other than that, pretty sad story about his work and his downfall. I am glad that, you know, him being in existence recently enough to have caught charges for whatever the hell falls under, or fell under laws against sodomy at the time, he was able to be cleared of that recently, as well as many other historical figures in London and the greater area of Britain. So very, very cool that that happened and that we can remember Oscar Wilde for the beautiful parts of his identity and humanity. So moving on to the next section, a pretty interesting one to close off the video. So this next section is a bit of a sour note. It does mention the incident that happened with the, I always forget what the institute is called before I read it, but yeah, Institute for Sexual Science, I believe, and it was burned down by a group of German Nazi youth, and we lost a huge, huge part of research on sexuality, more specifically a lot of information on transgenderism, and just a big downer moment in queer history. There's a lot more we could have retained from that era that would have helped advance things a little more smoothly in that area of science. But something that did happen, there was a lot of book burning on top of that in Nazi Germany at the time. So let's learn a little bit more about that. So, just a note, this is segueing off of a previous section, but I could only fit so much into one video. So just keep in mind if this sounds kind of weird when I started off. So, science wasn't the only driving force behind Germany's comparatively liberal attitudes towards sex and sexuality. In 1919, Germany entered a transformative new era of government known as the Weimar Republic. Germany emerged from the First World War with a crippling reparations debt that triggered extreme hyperinflation of the German currency. Newly minted money would lose its value within hours, so the only thing to do was to spend it as quickly as possible. While tragic for the German economy, there is something kind of fun about the idea. People had little choice but to descend into a life of intoxicated hedonism, and many spent their increasingly meaningless papier marks at Berlin's brand new cabaret shows. In the world of cabaret, sex took center stage, and Berlin quickly gained a reputation for the risque. If you've seen the 1972 film Cabaret, based on gay writer Christopher Isherwood's sojourn in Berlin, you'll know exactly what we mean here. Isherwood was one of the many gay and lesbian visitors from across Europe and North America who were drawn to Berlin's alluring nightlife, hustlers, quality drugs, and abundant gay bars. Yeah, I really want to go to Berlin. Berlin was also unique for its established lesbian bar scene, which allowed a strong lesbian subculture to thrive. A women's only night at a bar called Dorian Gray, yet another reference to Oscar Wilde, which we coincidentally just read about, was a favorite among Berlin's lesbians. The scene grew so much throughout the 1920s that a lesbian bar guide was eventually published, as well as the world's first lesbian magazine, all to help women navigate this burgeoning community. Women at these bars established a style of modern androgynous dress that would influence lesbian fashion for decades. Hats, tailored trousers, leather ties, and a cigar in hand. Women who dressed in this way were known as beaubies, which translates to little boy, but the context of the lesbian bar scene meant butch. Throughout much of history, masculine women have been seen as anti-fashion, but along the streets of Schöneberg during the 1920s, butch women were all the rage. In the face of all this hyperinflation-driven hedonism, the Weimar government couldn't exactly hang their hat on the economy, but they could get behind another respected pillar of German society, science. The Weimar Republic came to pride itself on its progressive ideas, philosophy, and scientific inquiry, and sexual reform was on the agenda everywhere. Which brings us back to Magnus Hirschfeld. Activists from the scientific communities were pushing to repeal paragraph 175 and also other sexual freedoms like the availability of birth control and decriminalization of sex work and abortion. This laid the perfect groundwork for Magnus Hirschfeld's greatest achievement, the Institute for Sexual Science. It also lists the German name here, but I will not even start to try to pronounce that. Sorry, I actually cannot read that. Founded by Hirschfeld in 1919, the Institute was a first-of-its-kind research center that cemented sexology, or the study of sexuality, as a legitimate academic field. Here, Hirschfeld would build his work on the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and advocate for emerging homosexual minority. As the Institute for Sexual Science, Hirschfeld pioneered the first hormone replacement therapy, as well as early gender affirmation surgeries. These were monumental, not just as medical advances, but because they sought to affirm transgender identities rather than cure them, as many of Hirschfeld's contemporaries argued for. Hirschfeld worked to have transgender people issued with transvestite passes. Sorry, I know that's I just realized as I read that I know that's still a sensitive word these days, but it is listed in the book and for historical purposes. I guess that's why it's included in the passage. But that is how they were described back then. At least the minority of people that were considered transgender in some form. So it was kind of like a hall pass for trans people in German society. Which is very cool. Very, very cool that they were given any kind of pass at all in a society back in that troubling time. While cross-dressing or identifying as a gender other than the one you were assigned at birth wasn't illegal, trans people who didn't pass as their gender could be harassed by police for being a public nuisance. Thanks to documentation issued at the Institute for Sexual Science, trans people could go out in German society presenting as their true gender. While admittedly clunky, these passes demonstrate a level of acceptance for transgender people that far surpassed the rest of the world at the time. Tolerance, however, does not necessarily translate to opportunity, and while society was more progressive, homosexual and transgender people faced stigma and discrimination, especially when it came to finding work. To counter this, many of Hirschfeld's transvestites were given work within the Institute for Sexual Science. Throughout the 1920s, the Institute set the world standard for research into human gender and sexuality, directly benefiting from homosexual and transgender people, as well as cisgender women for decades after it shut. It would have been able to continue throughout the rest of the 20th century. We can only imagine how progressed our ideas about the diversity of gender and sexuality might be, if only it had been. So sadly, we'll never know, because in 1933, while Magnus Hirschfeld was speaking on a tour, a group of Nazi youth called the German Student Union looted the Institute for Sexual Science and burnt all the books in the library. They arrived shouting, Brian Hirschfeld, I believe, which translates to Burn Hirschfeld, and set fire to countless volumes of scientific research on gender and sexuality. It was the first major book burning of the Third Reich. Ew. The significance of this cannot be understated, yet so few people are aware of what was lost in these book burnings. Today, it's common to hear people talk about the emergence of transgender identities, like these identities are somehow new. Like there wasn't once a massive library full of research into the spectrum of gender and sexuality that was lost at the hands of one of the greatest evils of the 20th century. Being both Jewish and an advocate for homosexuality, Magnus Hirschfeld had enough experience of being persecuted and even beaten by the anti-Semitic and homophobic right to know he could not return to Berlin. He moved to Paris right before settling in Nice in southern France, where he attempted to start anew and set up a new sexology research institute, but he died of a heart attack not long afterwards, on his 67th birthday. Unfortunate. Hirschfeld was cremated in Nice, and his ashes placed in a tomb beneath a slab reading Per Scientiam and ad Justitiam. I think that's what it said. An enduring reminder that his belief through science, justice is possible. So, yeah, very unfortunate section to end the video on, but I think a very necessary section to talk about. I think the loss of our information with sexology research at that point in our existence is very unfortunate, and Hirschfeld definitely did not deserve to die as young as he did and have so much of his work destroyed like that. I don't want to get too far into it in this video, because this is a video meant for you to relax, and I don't really want to bring up hateful stuff, but Nazis are awful, awful people, and even being a minority today are still somehow prevalent in society and should definitely should be shut down at any cost. Definitely not a good group of people. A very ignorant group that believes they are superior to many others, including people like Hirschfeld. And very unfortunate that we can't come to an understanding with people like these. So definitely one of the few groups in society that is very okay to put down today. And I think that's very important to spread the message, of that. If, you didn't obviously know already that Nazis are pretty bad people. So screw any Nazis that happen to be listening to this video, although I'm not sure they would stick around to this point. But other than that, yeah, just very, very unfortunate that we lost that, that research, especially because Hirschfeld seemed so adamant on going about curing transgenderism correctly. And I say that with all respect to transgender people, because I believe that the cure to transgenderism is not reversing or repressing your gender identity. I believe that it's molting into your new gender identity and finding comfort within yourself as another identity than you previously were before. I think that right there, through medical therapy and other means, is the true cure to transgenderism. So just making sure that everybody understands that's why I'm using that language when I approach how I believe transgenderism should be approached by people in the modern age. And I think it's very beautiful that we have a lot of medical remedies and methodologies of going about transitioning into, a new person. frankly, and I think it does wonders for a lot of people. I know gender dysphoria causes depression among many, many other things. So considering that a mental state that should be grown from, I think is dysphoria, I mean, is what I'm referring to when I say all this. I think that's a very beautiful thing, and something we should definitely have a lot of focus on going on, while we advance through all these modern waves of medicine. So, yeah. Closing thoughts, I think, because I've taken up so much time already. Really amazing book. Thank you again to Hannah McElhenney for writing that really cool book. Learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know before, and had a lot of cool stuff to highlight in this video. So I don't really have anything else to say that I didn't have already at the beginning of the video. So thank you so much if you stuck it through all the way through this. I don't know how long this video is, but I've recorded a long time, so I'm just gonna shut it off here and hope you guys enjoy. So happy Pride Month, guys. Happy celebrating. Be safe out there. Yada yada. I will see you in the next video. This is JSMR. Peace.